Welcome to Crowdmark Sessions, where we bring educators together to explore innovative teaching practices and redefine learning in today's world. Join us as we dive into discussions that inspire and transform the way we think about education. My name is Michelle Caers, and I'm the host of Crowdmark Sessions podcast. I'm also the co-founder and CEO of Crowdmark, the leading grading and assessment system for education. Our mission and values of integrity, collaboration, and community are at the core of everything we do at Crowdmark. In this podcast, we'll be interviewing trailblazers from our community of educators to hear their perspectives on learning, technology, and the changing landscape of education. We've got a phenomenal list of guests that will be appearing on the podcast, and we look forward to sharing their ideas with you. Welcome to Crowdmark Sessions. My name is Michelle Caers, and I am your host. Today, we're delving into a topic that's capturing everyone's attention: artificial intelligence, specifically its role in education. We have the pleasure of hosting Joseph Wilson from the University of Toronto, who will share his expertise on this increasingly ubiquitous technology. But before we welcome him to the studio, let's take a moment to explore some key facts and figures about AI in education. Artificial intelligence is making its mark across every industry, and in recent years, it's become a major focus in education. According to market.us, the global AI and edtech market size is expected to be worth around $92 billion by 2033. That's up from $3.65 billion in 2023. So over 10 years, growing at an annual growth rate of almost 40% per year. Not only are educators talking about AI, but they're actively integrating it into their routines. According to Microsoft Education blog, 47% of education leaders use AI daily, while 68% of educators and 62% of students have used AI at least once. While AI is increasingly integrated into education, concerns remain about its impact on students, especially with tools like ChatGPT. A survey revealed that 67% of students believe AI helps them study more efficiently, and 73% say it improves their understanding of material. Interestingly, students who study 3 or more hours per night are more likely to use ChatGPT, indicating they view it as a learning aid rather than a shortcut. But what are the greater implications of AI in education, and does it live up to the hype? Let's find out. So my guest today is Joseph Wilson, and he is a doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto studying how scientists use metaphor in laboratory communication. His book, Humans of AI: Understanding the People Behind the Machines, will be released in spring 2025. I know I'm really looking forward to that. He has written for CBC Parents, Anthropology News, American Scientist, The Globe and Mail, and Toronto Star, and has spoken at conferences across North America. Joe worked as a high school teacher, director of business development at Sponge Lab Interactive, and co-founded the education cluster at Mars Discovery District. He has designed exhibits and curricula for the Ontario Science Centre and the Royal Ontario Museum. In 2007, he co-founded the Treehouse Group, producing workshops and conferences, including Toronto's first Mini Maker Fair and the Treehouse Talks speaker series. Thank you for being here today, Joe. We're really excited to hear your thoughts and your firsthand experience in how AI is changing education, for better or for worse.
Good. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation as well.
Awesome. So let's start by establishing a baseline for everyone. What do we mean by artificial intelligence? Can you define that for us? And can you share maybe a high-level history from its inception to where we are today?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's one of those questions that everybody has a different answer to. AI as a term is kind of a notoriously slippery thing to pin down, which is one of the reasons I'm interested in investigating the field of AI from the perspective of an anthropologist.
Hmm.
What does AI mean culturally to us? What does it mean socially? And how has that meaning changed over time? So, one of the things we can do is look back to the inception of the term, right? It was first used in 1954 by a computer scientist named John McCarthy, and who worked with Marv Minsky at MIT, who many people know as kind of the father of artificial intelligence or one of the earliest researchers. And back then, the term AI was coined and used to describe a very specific kind of computer functioning, which we would now call symbolic AI. So basically, there are lots of pathways and decision trees hard coded into the mainframes. And the goal, of course, was to get it to do things like play chess or give opinions on topics. But it didn't work very well. That was the problem. Is that all of the kind of grand prognostications of these guys, and it was all guys, which is a problem we can talk about later. There was a lot of people who were disappointed with the results of all this money that was being pumped into this new industry, and things cooled for a while. They call this the AI winter. Um,
Okay.
it was kind of revived in the 80s under the name of what we would call expert systems. So this is the idea of, can we take everything that's in the mind of this doctor and just upload it into a computer and then have people interact with the doctor? So AI had shifted in the 80s to refer to these very specific expert systems. And then in the 2000s, the term AI referred to what we would now call neural networks.
Hmm.
And in the kind of 2010s, terms like deep learning came in vogue. But of course, neural networks were not AI until it was. That was very different from the kind of symbolic AI approach. And people we know now, like Geoffrey Hinton, who kind of famously developed the techniques of deep learning that form the basis of the kind of AI we're familiar with now, he couldn't get papers published in artificial intelligence journals or at AI conferences because what he was doing was not considered AI. Of course, now it is, much to his amusement. you know, in the last couple of years, what we now call AI refers to, again, a very specific subset, which we call generative AI. So that's
Hmm.
the Chat GPTs of the world, DALI and Midjourney. These algorithms, these platforms that actually make new text or make new video or make new audio. There's music ones and speech ones out now. So the term is very broad, and as such, for me in my work, it makes sense to think of AI not as a scientific concept, but as a cultural concept, as a kind of bundle of cultural fears and hopes about the future of humanity. We kind of pin our hopes onto this idea, but it is just an idea. The reality under the hood, running in these computers is a lot more complicated.
Yes, absolutely. You were talking about AI's first inception around the 1950s, and it reminded me of the 1968 film A Space Odyssey 2001, and how this computer just takes over. I remember, the very famous quote, "What are you doing, Dave?" um,
Yeah, yeah.
and there was a lot of fear around what will technology do, and what will so-called artificial intelligence mean for us. And then now
Hmm.
we have folks like Elon Musk famously saying that AI is, dangerous, and we need to be really careful about it. And then Jack Ma saying that he doesn't think it matters at all, and that humans are so unique that AI will never be what it is. Given that
Hmm.
you're studying this and you're looking at the cultural influence of AI, where do you stand in that view?
Well, I mean, the first answer I'll give is kind of a cop-out answer, which is that as an anthropologist, my interest is in tracing those conversations. And I mean, the cool thing about AI is that it really serves as a platform for people to talk to each other about what it means to be human and the things we value in life, right? And the things that we value, say, in an education system or in an economy, or the things we value culturally. And so my first instinct is to say, I don't have an opinion. I just trace these opinions. And your reference to 2001, I think, is actually a good one because Musk, Sam Altman, a lot of the kind of AI evangelists, and I would include Musk in that category, even though he purports to be really scared of AI. Of course, behind the scenes, he's investing billions in his own AI company. But of course, he's convinced that he can do it right and safely.
Right.
But that's kind of the hubris of the Silicon Valley entrepreneur, I think. But these tech evangelists, they look to these science fiction films almost as challenges or predictions as to what could happen in the future, as opposed to, I think, the way the general public reads them, or dare I say, should read them, as morality tales or parables of what could go wrong. Right?
Mm,
This is the Sorcerer's Apprentice, or the Monkey's Paw, or Frankenstein. Right? The kind of unintended consequences of the hubris of technology. Like Sam Altman tweeting out her,
oh yeah.
reference to the movie Her when they demoed their new voice assistant, which of course uncannily resembled Scarlett Johansson's character from Her. It was almost like he didn't watch the whole movie, right? Because of course the movie is
Right.
not an aspirational state to be in. It's about this man who's grieving the loss of his partner and his struggles with that. And so I think it's an interesting, again, culturally really interesting that these guys are kind of pinning their work to cultural these cultural artifacts like films and movies in the science fiction genre that the rest of us view, kind of differently. I think my own opinion on that argument is that there is certainly something unique about humans. My own subfield of anthropology is linguistic anthropology. So my feeling is that that's very much connected to language and what's called in the academy semiosis, which is symbols, right?
Hmm.
And our ability to read meaning into symbols and into words and into talk and into gesture. And I think that's something that's very unique. And that's something that things like ChatGPT and Midjourney do a great job of copying or faking, but they're not doing what we're doing.
Right.
And I think in education, that's a huge distinction to make because the interactive element and the kind of emergence of learning through the interaction of people is where learning happens. And if you substitute kind of an ersatz intelligence there, I think you'll get ersatz learning. You won't get the full rich experience of human to human development.
And that's a great segue into some research that I did in preparation for our discussion today. The National Education Association Task Force on AI in Education defined AI in three different categories. They started out with reactive AI, which are tools that respond to specific inputs or situations without learning from the past experiences. So, for example, here would be AI assistants like Alexa and Siri, or household tools like a Roomba vacuum. Then there's
Right.
predictive AI tools, which analyze historical data and experiences to predict future events or behaviors. And that would be like when you're watching Amazon or Netflix and they suggest you might like this movie. And then finally, there's generative AI tools such as ChatGPT and Gemini that generate novel text, images, videos, and other content based existing data patterns or structures. And with those tools, they're all intelligent to a certain degree, but lack consciousness.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed wholeheartedly. Yeah, there's a kind of a trend amongst the technorati in Silicon Valley to claim that there's nothing inherently different between some of these generative systems and a human mind. You know, and we can get lost in debates on whether these things are conscious or not conscious. Um, but I think the interesting thing is to look at them in the light of take a more pragmatic view. In your introduction, you were talking about some of the surveys and studies that have been done on how people are using different AI tools, and whether they perceive it to be helping them learn. And a lot of those surveys ask people's opinion. Does this help you learn? What do you use it for? What do you like using it for? And that's valid data. But we have to remember that somebody's self-report of what helps them learn is different from proof of what actually helps them learn, right? There's often a huge difference between what people say and the reality behind the scenes. So it can be fun to play with. You can think it's helping, but it might not be.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things on that last category that you identified, generative AI. I mean, because predictive and reactive AI, I mean, we've kind of been using that for, I mean, in some cases, decades already, right? I
It
mean, I
seems
mean,
to be
the
something people are used to.
yeah, I mean, like Google's search engine is remarkable. I mean, and I think would qualify under most definitions as a kind of artificial intelligence.
Mhm.
But again, here's the kind of slipperiness of that term again. What do we want to include and what do we want to not include? You know, a search engine's old news now, so it's not AI anymore. It's just like that's just the way the internet works, right? Um, but I think the generative AI is really interesting because it's producing quote unquote novel content, but really it's producing, any of these generative tools are very conservative and they're inherently uncreative because they they create new content that is based on old content. And it has
Right.
to fit, for example, in a recognizable genre, say of a recommendation letter or a student essay, point proof comment in each paragraph. They are genre machines, right? So they
Mhm.
are not pushing the boundaries of what constitutes a genre. They're not making productive mistakes as we want students to make. They're not taking risks in the same way that we want students to in their work. They are just producing content that adheres to a template, a formula, and they can only do so based on what they've already seen in their training data. So in some senses, that the word generative is a little misleading as well, because they're really just kind of copying and remixing. And
Right.
we always want our students to do more than that, right? Even if it means, chunks of that essay are incomprehensible, we can recognize when they're trying something new or when they're pushing themselves out of their comfort zone.
Absolutely. So, there's a saying, garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah,
And,
yeah,
with generative AI, if it's just regurgitation of information that it's sifting through on the internet, a lot of times the responses that it spits out are untruths, completely
yeah,
fabricated out of nowhere, which I don't know. Back when ChatGPT first came out, I did a little test and asked it to write my bio, and
Nice.
and it came back with this, complete fantasy story about who I was married to and how many children I had and where I studied and what my job was, and none of it was reality. Even though I have various bios out there on the internet from speaking engagements, so students and need to be aware that what they're searching for on these generative AI platforms may not actually have any truth when they get the results.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I haven't done that with my bio yet, but I should give it a try just to see what it invents. But it's true, and even things like some people, I've had this experience where you've asked ChatGPT to make an image, with certain words in it, and it will double down and tell you that it spelled the thing correctly, even though it's clearly hasn't. Um, and there's this term that Gary Marcus uses, who is an AI researcher, but is a strident critic of this current wave of generative AI, and he says, you know, taken from the military, often wrong, but always confident, right? It's
Right.
like, as long as you've got confidence, it's you can be wrong all the time. But one of the things that I think I think that's a really good point, and a point that would be a great teachable moment for students, because large language models and any generative model, they don't have any concept of true and false. They don't have any concept of mapping to the real world. They are just doing these statistical associations between words or between pixels or between kind of sound waves. Um, and they have no conception that things could be true or false. That's something we impose on it afterwards. We
Hmm.
ask, oh, does this accord with the real world? Does it map to something that I know or something that is true? And so in that sense, LLMs are always hallucinating. The whole thing is a hallucination. It's just that sometimes that hallucination maps to the reality that we recognize between us, and sometimes it doesn't. We
Right.
call that truth and falsehood, or we call it accurate or inaccurate. But really, for the machine, it's all the same. There's no
Right.
difference at all. And I think that's a really important principle, because for students, the way we agree on what is true and what is false is through conversation and argument and experience in the world, right? It's a
Hmm.
social process, uncovering what is true, what is false, what is valuable, what is not valuable, what's offensive, what's inoffensive. These are constant conversations we're having between each other, um, and that's how we come to an agreement on what's true and false.
So
Is through interaction.
I think that's a really great point, and it introduces the next question I have for you very nicely, which we in the news in media we hear from technologists all the time about AI. But you, as you mentioned in your introduction, you're an anthropologist, and I'm wondering, why is it important to include social sciences in the artificial intelligence conversation?
Yeah, wow. I mean, I think it's crucial to include the social sciences in all discussions of science and technology, because, like, there's this cultural assumption that the science is practiced and the technology, that kind of the tools that come out of it, are kind of immune to the social forces that shape the rest of our lives, right? They
Mhm.
have this kind of the scientific process, which is supposed to be as as objective and as clear as possible in reaching goals. But of course, all the way through, the scientific process is being practiced by humans, and we really need to understand the ways in which humans, with their various biases and cultural perspectives, are actually practicing science in real life. not the kind of idealized version that's often described in science textbooks, but the real messy, on the ground, hacking together solutions version that happens in science labs. I mean, one great example of how kind of human, the human condition gets in the way of good science is with the COVID vaccine. I mean, we had this remarkable moment where in less than a year, scientists all across the globe collaborated to create a vaccine um, to this deadly pandemic, to this deadly disease. Um, and then everybody was shocked at the end when there was a significant chunk of the population around the world and in the US and here in Canada as well, who just decided they didn't want it, right? Who
Mhm.
decided, yeah, no, I'm good, you know, because of a whole host of kind of cultural baggage around attitudes to the pharmaceutical industry, attitudes towards government, privacy, economics. It's very complicated. I
Mhm.
often tell people when they ask me about my work, I often tell people that the science is the easy part. It's the humans that are hard, right? The humans that are complicated.
I think if you
Um,
ask any business leader, they're going to agree with you that the business side's fine. The hard part is the people.
yeah, that's right, eh? Well, and yet the kind of trope that we use when we describe sciences is that physics and computer science and engineering, those are the hard ones. And, the further along the scale you go towards the social sciences and humanities, those are the fluffy ones, right?
Mhm.
That's the realm of the kind of 21st century thinking skills that are often framed as like nice to have, as extras sprinkling on the top of the cake, but you really need to understand math, right? That's what
Mhm.
school's for, right? And I
Yes.
think it's really interesting that these things, computer science in the case of AI, cognitive science, they are the hardest of sciences until they're not anymore, until humans get involved. And then a lot of the computer scientists are like, I'm out because humans are way too hard to predict. Like, I'm
Right.
not sure what to do with this area of it. But that's why we need social sciences in the labs, in the classrooms, is to truly understand the human condition and the human reactions in situ, in sight, to these technical and scientific tools and discoveries.
I can 100% agree with you. In my own personal experience every day at Crowdmark, we have an excellent team, really talented in engineering and problem solving. And we have an excellent two or more excellent designers that work very hard to improve the user experience and make it very intuitive for our customers. Yet every single time we release a new feature, people use it in a way that we never anticipated or that we never expected. There's always someone who takes it to the next level. And these are all, these aren't necessarily bad things. These can be really good things in that now this new feature can do more than we thought, but other times it breaks. And it
Hmm.
breaks because we never expected someone to take the steps that they took to achieve whatever goal it was. So
Hmm.
this is something where we live every day, and it never ceases to surprise me.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I find that fascinating. I love it when people, I mean, it drives engineers crazy though, right? They're
Yeah.
just like, just do the thing that I want you to do, hit this button or to do this. But it's true, people never do. And I think that's remarkable, really, that we have this expectation of the way humans behave, and they're constantly surprising us. And
Yes.
that's what I try and understand is what's the thought process from their perspective. And it's never ending. It's like the engineers, it's like the engineers saying, that these things they create would be perfect if it weren't for the people who had to use them. You
Yeah,
know,
exactly.
and which actually reminds me of that saying in teaching, right? Where sometimes we feel like, oh man, teaching would be the greatest job if it just weren't for all the kids, like, you know, derailing my lesson plan or misunderstanding my instructions or purposefully kind of sabotaging the plan I have for the perfect lesson, right? But as we know, in those gaps, that's where the real education is, right?
That's
That's
right.
where it happens. It's not in the content that you think you're going to pour into their brains, before the class actually starts. It's in the arguments and the detours you have in the moment, and that's really hard to assess and really hard to appreciate. But that's the way the world works.
Absolutely. And, we at Crowdmark echo that, as we often say that we believe education is fundamentally a human to human experience, and that it has to be an exchange of ideas and information between people in order for learning to occur. So that leads me to my next question or conversation point. In an interview in the Decoder, the OpenAI CTO, Mira Murati, says AI systems could reach the intelligence of a PhD in certain fields in as little as a year and a half from now. So Murati says that older AI systems, and this is funny that she calls this older, like Chat GPT-3, have the intelligence of a toddler, while ChatGPT-4 is on par with a smart high school student. And so she sees major potential for AI in education and says, and I quote, "We have an opportunity to basically build super high quality education and very accessible and ideally free for anyone in the world in any of the languages or cultural nuances that you can imagine." So both you and I, Joe, have been involved in education and education technology for a decade or more. And we hear this kind of rhetoric all the time from technologists that their technology is going to going to revolutionize education. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on this latest promise?
Okay, my gloves are coming off now. Um, I despise that kind of rhetoric, to be blunt, because, well, there's a few things. First of all, it's true. The cynic in me hears the same rhetoric every few years with a new cycle of education technologies. I mean, Michelle, I met you back in the days when if you just added the word MOOC to anything that you could get funding, right?
Right.
And the promise was the same, of course, that that education would reach everybody around the world, and that it would democratize access, and that suddenly people would have access to any kind of learning that they wanted. There's two things here that really bother me about that. One is that it's the assumption that the only thing that matters is access to information, that all the other infrastructure around both education and around people's lives, like how they live their lives day to day in the villages they live in or the cities they live in, that all that stuff doesn't matter. That all it is a question of pouring information into people's heads, and they will magically become smarter, and have access to use that information in the world to make their lives better. Now, of course, access information is not nothing. Right? We need that, and the web has done. It's been incredible to see the access that people have had to information and to knowledge. But of course, that's not everything. Like that alone is not going to change things materially. The second problem I have, and it's related, is that the whole premise here, the idea that ChatGPT-3 is a toddler and that the next version was a high school student, the next version could be a PhD, the whole notion is based on an antiquated idea of what intelligence is. This idea that intelligence is a single thing that you can measure with numbers, ideally, right? If we're engineers, we want to measure it with numbers and quantify it, and that you can have more of it or less of it, or you can get more of it, or lose some of it, this thing called intelligence. Comparing comparing ChatGPT to these different levels of human development suggests that we get more intelligent as time goes on,
Mm-hmm.
which cognitively we know that's not true, right? If intelligence is anything meaningful at all, it's a bundle of skills, both bodily and cognitive, that exist from the moment we're born. I think you
Mm-hmm.
could make an argument that you know, babies, toddlers at least under the age of 3, are more intelligent than adults are, right? Because they can adapt faster, they can learn fast, well, they can learn some things a lot faster, language acquisition, for example, bodily movement, for example. Um, and so to decouple the so-called cognitive abilities, which often prioritize things like math, and language manipulation, kind of symbolic thinking,
Mm-hmm.
to decouple those from all the other things, like I was saying before, the soft skills like creativity or communication, or even kind of kinesthetic intelligence, right? How to use your body to swing a golf club, or how to troubleshoot fixing a motorcycle engine. The importance of touch, the importance of proprioception, right? How our sense of what our body is doing in real space. I don't think these are things that can be decoupled from this cognitive idea of intelligence in any meaningful way. I think they're a bundle of attributes that must go together if you want to get some sort of human-like performance. Another way of thinking about it real quick is that if you want to measure just purely kind of mathematical and cognitive level abilities,
Mm-hmm.
computers have been smarter than humans since the 50s, since AI was kind of established as a field.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but of course, so when people talk about human level performance, in some senses, computers have surpassed that since they were invented. I mean, that's why they were invented, right? It's because they can analyze patterns and crack codes better than a human mind can,
Mm-hmm.
because human minds forget things. We have egos, we have, our memories work in very different ways, and computers are really good at that other stuff. And so but of course, in some senses, computers are less intelligent than humans, and picking and choosing what you want to measure when, you can make that argument, but I don't think it's a meaningful argument at all. It's a kind of an incoherent statement, because we're not measuring the same thing here. Intelligence is not the thing that they think it is.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. As you were talking, it reminded me of this personal experience I had where I was beat by a machine, but it still didn't make any sense. And yet I had no recourse. And it's a very simple thing. I was driving here in Toronto, and if anyone who has ever been to Toronto or exists in Toronto today knows, traffic is insane and it's crazy. And there's this
Yeah.
one particular intersection where if you're turning left, it's almost impossible. Only one car ever gets through the intersection on a light change, because people, it seems for a lot of people in Toronto, a yellow light is, the go faster portion of the day.
That's
And
right.
you only stop after it's red for a couple seconds.
Right.
So I was in the left turning lane, trying to turn, and I stopped right before I have a small car. My wheels were right before the white line, which means I should never proceed if the light is red. But I was
Hmm.
turning left. I had been sitting there for a long time. I was waiting to turn left, but the traffic was coming at me and they were running the yellow and the red light. So finally, when it was open, I turned left. And then the red light camera took a picture of my car.
Hmm.
And at the time, there were points related to it, and I didn't want to miss the points. So I decided to represent myself in court. I went to court, and we were about to proceed with with my case, and the public prosecutor recused himself. He said he wasn't well versed enough in this particular matter, and we would have to delay it for another month. And the judge said, I don't think so. This Miss Caers came here today for this, so we're going to proceed. But I'll give you, 15-minute recess. So the attorney went upstairs. He got a colleague. The colleague printed out this huge picture of my car and the red light. And she brought it down. She put it on the desk in front of me and said, "The only thing I need to prove is that the light was red and your car was behind this line." And I
Yeah,
wanted
right.
to argue I was following the traffic rules, but had I turned when the light was the right color, this car would have hit me, and then there would
Mm,
have been an accident. So I wanted to plead the case that I did the right thing.
right.
And she came back and said, "This picture is all the proof that's required." So I ended up taking a plea and just paying a small fine. But it was very frustrating that
Yeah, yeah,
none of the human considerations or judgment. And I think the driving analogy is on par right now with all these automated cars and all the accidents that they're getting in and things like that, where machines are not in a place yet where they can make good judgment, and
yeah.
humans sometimes fall victim to these bad situations.
I think, yeah, that's a great story, and I think most people have similar kinds of things where they feel trapped by the system, both bureaucratic and technological, right? There's a system that is determined, the algorithm has decided X for you, and the process to dispute that, or the process to understand, is obscure or non-existent, right?
Mhm.
So I think the part of the problem is that people in general have this anxiety about kind of being trapped into systems they don't understand. And this is part of the reason why it baffles me that, well, I think a lot of the big tech companies in Silicon Valley, they claim that the way out of this bind is more AI or more
Right.
technology, right? Oh, we'll just allow them more control, and then they will find the optimal solutions for us. And I think that they are vastly underestimating the backlash against automation that comes from the general public. Yeah, I think self-driving cars is a perfect example, right? The kind of public pushback, especially in the valley where these self-driving cars were starting to be really visible on the street. The problem is that these technological systems, ChatGPT, a red light camera, automatic algorithms that decide who is eligible for welfare or not, they are not inherently accountable, right? Between humans, if somebody makes a decision you don't agree with, you can challenge them on it. You
Mhm.
can ask them to explain themselves. And we do that with the assumption that there is a person there who has values, opinions, expertise, and can justify or explain a choice. And that exchange, that back and forth, that justification is what creates social cohesion. It's what creates society.
Mhm.
Just like I was talking about between teachers and students, it's not the content, it's the conversation that makes a learner, right? Or
Mhm.
that makes a society. I don't think that's an overstatement. And when we are arguing with machines, we know there's no there, right? There's no person
Right.
behind to be held accountable. It's unclear who is the person responsible for that red light camera. And I think that the prosecuting lawyer knows that as well.
Right.
They have a job to do. They know that this image, although the image strips out all the context of how fast the traffic was going that day, about what the kind of local, and by local I mean that exact intersection, the local norms of turn taking. The prosecutor knows that all that is stripped out, but they just have a job to do,
That's
and
right.
they're
Yeah.
gonna do it. But yeah, I think there's a huge anxiety there that the tech companies are completely underestimating.
So we saw this in real time actually during the pandemic when students and educators were all working from home, studying from home, and suddenly educators had to change all of their approaches to teaching and learning to an online format. And one of the big challenges was how to ensure academic integrity in assessment. So, some of the ways that people thought they could solve it was with technology and using online proctoring solutions that could record student activity during an assessment and then report if there was any unusual or inconsistent behavior. And then, as these solutions were rolled out, it became abundantly clear that there was a lot of baked in bias and unfairness in how these different models treated different students depending on their race or their socioeconomic background, whether they had a quiet room with the top technology to themselves, or if they were sharing a room and there was movement in the back, or students just simply had exam anxiety and couldn't really handle the surveillance of these things. And so what we really discovered, you know, putting this kind of AI into education was that it could lead to unfair treatment of students.
Mm.
So, do you have any thoughts on that and how we can be a little bit more aware or careful to avoid those situations?
Yeah, that it's a huge, huge topic and area of concern. One of the things I think, in very general terms, this goes back to one of your initial questions, is if we get more social scientists and to tell the stories of the people who are making the technology and where these models and where these surveillance systems come from, I think the public will have a better understanding that they're not these magic standalone systems that can promise perfect performance every time. They are human created technologies. They're created by humans. They take human data, which means that they are going to have embedded in them all the biases and foibles that humans have.
Hmm.
At least that is encoded in text form, say, or in visual form, right? So the training sets that are used to train a lot of these, say, facial recognition technologies have far more men than women in. They have far more light-skinned faces than dark-skinned faces, and as such, these systems perform in accordance with their training data, right? They find it a lot harder to classify darker skinned people, for example. This shouldn't be a surprise to us, right? Technology comes from somewhere always, but the rhetoric of the tech companies hides that process, right?
Right.
They present these products like Gemini or like ChatGPT as fully formed kind of magical tools that will work for you without any sense of how they came to be. And I think that's dangerous because then we attribute to them powers that they aren't necessarily capable of,
Hmm.
and that can harm people. That harms kids. I mean, the COVID pandemic was an extraordinary experience for people. It was not business as usual, and I think if anything, those say the use of those kind of surveillance technologies to ensure integrity in assessment showed us the flaws in our existing models of assessment. I hope, rather than, some people wanted to frame this as, look, teenagers are always looking for ways to cheat and to game the system, which is something we heard, when these new technologies were being applied as well, right? Is that like,
Hmm.
oh, the kids are always trying to find a way around the rule. Of course they are. That's sort of their job, right?
Right.
Um, and so it was an interesting time. And I think if one good thing came out of it, it at least in the parents that I've talked to, it reinstilled the importance of, if not face to face, then at least interactional teaching and learning and assessment,
Hmm.
right? We are, of course, constrained by the the numbers of the system. If you're doing an undergrad course with 2,000 students, you can't have rich kind of interactive assessment every time. We have to, we sometimes need multiple choice and Scantron and stuff. But I think this idea, this glimpse of the future that parents had, where maybe all education could be online, and you just interact with your AI friend and take assessment through the webcam. It was immediately clear to parents how isolating and damaging that could be, especially for the most vulnerable kids.
Right.
And so maybe that's a good thing, is that maybe it reaffirmed our belief that education and the social side of education needs to be forefront for kids.
Absolutely. Well, Crowdmark does handle these large scale classes and helps them provide feedback. So we've seen a big move back to in person paper based assessments where students can access any technology. They're using their pencils, and sometimes traditional methods can be the most effective. Maybe not it may not be the best assessment type every time to sit down for 2 hours and write out what you remember. But at the same time, there needs to be some assessment in education in order for students to even know what they don't know. So, and the instructors to
Yeah.
know what they need to teach. So, a couple of weeks ago, on June 20th, the California legislature voted unanimously for a bill to stop artificial intelligence bots from replacing community college faculty in the state.
Mm,
So
interesting.
here are the technologists trying to replace the faculty, and now they're passing laws to say you can't do that. Do you think that type of legislation is needed?
Huh. I mean, I think in some sense, yes. Not because bots are so good at it, that they can replace teachers, but just because there's always a pressure on organizations, public and private, to cut costs and to find efficiencies. There's you often hear people say, "Oh, AI will take your job," or "AI can do that job."
Hmm.
Um, AI will never replace anybody's job. A manager will replace your job if they think that the AI can do it better. And in most cases, it can't. It's just that the rhetoric from the sales teams say
Hmm.
that it can, right?
Hmm.
Oh, you want ad copy? You can, ChatGPT can do it for you. So it's not the AI that's replacing your job. It's the manager who is under pressure to cut costs who is going to replace your job, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's really important. Like when we talk about labor, the labor, the AI systems are tools in that, but the labor system, or the kind of the labor arrangement, is developed and designed by humans. And in some sense, we need to push back a bit against this kind of the fetish for cost cutting and the look for efficiencies. And perhaps that can happen through legislation. I mean, the irony in the case of California is, of course, that while they were doing this or passing this legislation, for the last better part of a year, the Los Angeles and area school district was putting, I think they put about $6 million into ed. This was the name they gave to the AI, the personalized AI tutor that would be rolled out for every student in the Los Angeles County area. Um,
Interesting.
and the CTO of the LA district was quoted as saying, when a reporter asked them, "I thought we were trying to reduce screen time," and he was saying, "Well, no, no, no. Like, it's totally different. If they're interacting with Ed, that's their AI buddy who will create kind of personalized pathways in education for them, whereas all the other stuff kids do online is poison." Right? And it just shows the confusion in what these tools can do. and just last week, even a couple days ago, I think the New York Times just broke a story where this whole ed experiment has basically failed. The company is all but bankrupt.
Oh dear.
They've laid off almost everybody. All of the existing kind of pilot users of the system have been locked out, and there's basically nothing left of this infrastructure. Which, I mean, if you've been tracking edtech news over the last 20 years, that's not new, right? If we entrust educational functions to startups, a lot of them are going to fail, right?
Yes.
And that leaves teachers and parents and students in the lurch. So, I mean, yeah, I think that's actually a great example of this kind of confusion over what can they do, what should they do, and how do we use the tools of like public office or bureaucracy to protect certain people. It's an open question, and it's a fascinating one. I would have loved to have been in that boardroom when they were debating both of these initiatives, right? And like,
Right.
what are the arguments being used? It's that's fascinating. Yeah.
I hadn't heard of that, Ed, and then I agree with you. It's not surprising to me that it didn't work out. There are a lot of assumptions that go into how people will use tools, like we talked about earlier. So we're coming to the end here. I do have a couple more questions for you before we wrap up. There's one that I think is really important for us to explore, and that is intellectual property concerns, data privacy and security around these large language models. So AI systems in higher education often require access to vast amounts of student data, and this raises significant privacy concerns. And it's not only privacy concerns around student data, which is protected or should be protected, but also intellectual property provided by instructors and students, where students' ideas are being put forth and instructors' assessments and questions and teaching techniques, and having these absorbed by large language models who then profit from this intellectual property is becoming more and more problematic. And I'm just wondering if you have any views to share on that aspect of this conversation.
Yeah, it's a really important thread to untangle, and I think we're just scratching the surface with this. It's interesting to think about how different intellectual property laws would be if human minds operated like computer minds. So by that I mean, if a human could read a book once and have 100% recall of everything they read, and they could, search through the book and find keywords in their minds, intellectual property laws would be very different, right? I don't think you could just go to a library and take out a book and bring it back, because you would have a perfect access to that information. But of course, that's the argument that's used by a lot of these tech companies, saying like, hey, our models are just learning from books and movies and music, just like you do, and then creating something new. But it's inherently different because they have 100% recall of everything, and they are just remixing and kind of regurgitating new form. So I think the concern is valid. I mean, as much as there were problems with sites like Teachers Pay Teachers and a lot of the places teachers would go online to get resources, at least at least in the early days, it was mostly teacher to teacher, and it was a direct sharing of resources. But if the large tech companies kind of scoop all that up, and they are the gatekeepers of who gets access to what, that can be really concerning, right? I mean, so no longer if you Google, well, I mean, now we're kind of in this in between state. But if you're Googling, a lesson plan for a very specific area, um, it's likely that instead of being directed to that teacher's blog or that teacher's resource files, Google will summarize that for you and present it to you as if it's coming from Google and not from this individual person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, them scooping up that intellectual property is a huge concern, and I think also that you mentioned it briefly there, but there's an under appreciation for the violation of intellectual property rights for students and the
Mhm.
work they produce. We are so strict about plagiarism coming from students. If we can detect any sort of pattern matching, through Turnitin or anything. But of course, Turnitin and the companies like it, they use the text that is uploaded to their systems. They use that to create their product. So they are using those essays and all that intellectual property that the students have created to create their own product without any attribution or recognition, which I think you could make a good argument is a kind of plagiarism. So it's interesting that, when students are submitting work and teachers are submitting lesson plans, if they are stored in any digital system, we need to have a good understanding of where it's going and what it's being used for. And right now, that's so blurry and obscure that it's going to take a while to sort out. So I can understand the hesitance, the skepticism. Right? I mean, this app in LA is a great example because, of course, when that company went under, they said they had really strict privacy requirements, that the data would be kind of in a walled garden, wouldn't be accessible to anybody, nor be used externally. But now that the company is essentially disbanded, what happens to that data? When these companies collapse or when these companies have privacy breaches, there aren't good protocols to follow on what to do with that data and on how to treat it. It might just get passed off into the ether of the internet or scooped up by a data broker. We don't know, and if the company itself is disbanded, there's no accountability there either. So it can be super messy, and we're just starting to untangle this stuff.
Yes, I've seen from a lot of our customers and universities are now formalizing their policy on AI in education and what professors and students can do and providing guidelines around use. And it's all publicly available. I did a search. You can easily find these pages, but it also indicates that people are just finding their way and they don't no one really has the answer yet, and it's really
Mm,
really early days. And we've been here before. The early days of the internet were like the wild wild west.
yeah.
Anything goes. I feel like we're in a very similar situation now with AI, and it's being applied to almost every startup or every technology company today. I shouldn't say startup. The biggest ones, Microsoft and Google, are all talking about AI and how it's being integrated into our everyday lives. And yet nobody really knows where it's going to go and what it's going to, if the promise that everyone is making is actually going to be real and
Hmm.
realized for the positive as opposed to the negative, which we kind of talked a little bit about,
Yeah.
uh, the movies and the fear in the beginning. So
Yeah.
just
What
one last
yeah.
question for you,
Yeah.
which is, you are writing a book, and we were
Mhm.
talking earlier that AI is changing so quickly every day. Could you tell us a little bit more about your book and what it's about, and like what is this writing process like?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that your first point there is true. Things are change so fast in AI that it's difficult to know when to stop adding things into the manuscript, right? I
Right?
submitted a first draft about 4 or 5 months ago, and I mean, I would say a third of it in my mind is already I want to change it, right, or add things. One of the things I did practically is I wrote it in the past tense, right? So I
Yeah.
wrote it imagining, okay, people are going to be reading this in 2025 about what happened in 2023, this kind of the chat GPT moment. And I'm writing about it in hindsight, looking back. One of the core questions of the book is what happened in 2023? Why did everybody lose their minds about this new thing? Why did people I mean, AI was kind of famous as being this field with a constantly receding horizon, right? Where AI was almost always defined as the thing that computers can't do yet, right? But suddenly in 2023, or the end of 2022, people decided, oh yeah, no, this is it. It's here, and either it's going to change the world and save us all from climate change to the opioid epidemic. Like AI would just magically fix everything, or that we're in deep trouble and that AI is going to kind of again kind of magically mess everything up. The the variable that was always missing from any of those stories was the human element. Who are the people that are making these technologies? From the silicon chips that run these neural networks to the content moderators, right? That make it seem like AI is doing it all autonomously, but really there's people behind the scenes making decisions, to the humans that have created the content on the internet upon which these big models were trained. And so if we think about the tech stack, all the things necessary for AI to function, I'm trying to get people to focus on the human stack, all the humans that are all the way down the chain that are working so hard to make it seem like there are no humans working behind the scenes. So that's the focus of the book. You know, one last thing I wanted to point out. I think you're right that it is in many ways like the early days of the internet, with lots of experiments happening. That one of the big differences, though, I think, is that there are these 5 companies that have so much power and control over what happens online. And of course, now we're seeing this race between them to kind of own the AI infrastructure, right? Whether it's Anthropic or OpenAI or Google. You know, Anthropic now has a partnership with Amazon, and of course, OpenAI famously has a partnership with Microsoft. And if those same few companies own the AI infrastructure, then all these conversations we have about value and fit for purpose and labor will be dictated or controlled by them. And that's something that worries me, which is why I think it's so important for smaller companies like Crowdmark to get involved and to kind of stamp their values on the kinds of work we want to do in education. I don't think I've ever told you this, Michelle, but the name Crowdmark I really like because it implies that the marking in the process of assessment is something that happens in a crowd, right, with people, right? It's not individual. It doesn't stay at the level of the individual. It's something that has to be distributed amongst a crowd, right? Whether that's your classroom or whether it's a community of professors or community of teachers. And so I think that's a really important dynamic to keep, right? The fetish of individualized and personalized education is sometimes spoken of as displacing this idea that you're learning with the community. If you can just learn directly one-on-one with your AI, you'll suddenly be the smartest person in the room. That's not the way that's not the way learning works, right? It needs to be a social process, and you need to be part of the crowd, right, to make it sing.
Absolutely. And I couldn't have said it better. Thank you for that. I didn't know that. I didn't know you had that view on our name. It certainly holds true that we agree, and our company philosophy is about this human to human interaction. And it's true at every stage in life. We don't work independently. We work with a community. We work with our coworkers, with other folks in the industry. All of it requires collaboration and exchange of ideas. And there's no one singular system that's going to solve everything for everyone.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, and choice, and adaptability is key in achieving our goals in that way, for sure.
Absolutely. Okay, so thank you so much, Joseph Wilson from University of Toronto, for joining us today. And just a reminder, his book is titled Humans of AI, Understanding the People Behind the Machines, and that will be released in spring 2025. Thanks again, Joe. Really great talk today. Really interesting.
Thank you. My pleasure. Yeah. Interesting chat.